My name is Charles Reese Gaddy. My father's name is Charlie Byrd Gaddy. Now, I thought so much of him and I admired him so much that when I went off to college, I started calling myself Charlie Gaddy. And so that's how I got to be Charlie. My mother wanted me to be a junior, and my father said, no, I'm not going to have my boy called Junior or Little Charlie. He's going to have a different name from mine. But anyway, I was born on September 17th, 1931 in Roxboro, North Carolina, in Person County. But I was only there 1 year when my father's job took him to Biscoe. So,
and tell us where Biscoe is.
Biscoe is the marker for the exact center of the state is within 2 miles of where I grew up. Biscoe is 2 miles from Star, and Star has the wonderful honor of being the geographical center of North Carolina. So Biscoe, to orient you if you don't know anything about it, would be between west of Raleigh, between here and Charlotte. The closest known town would be Pinehurst, which is south of Biscoe. And my father got there because he worked for Carolina Power and Light Company, and they had this huge substation in Biscoe that fed power to not only the homes, but the cotton mills and so forth, and all the little towns around. And he was a substation operator. That's why we moved to Biscoe, and that's where we settled, and that's where I grew up.
So you went to school at public schools?
Absolutely. Biscoe High School was the high school, and the little kids from first grade to high school we all went into the same building. And but the name of the school was Biscoe High School. I think it's the second oldest state-supported high school in North Carolina. Wow. And so you started in the first grade down on the first floor and moved on up to high school, and then when you got in high school, you got to go to the second floor. But we had wonderful teachers, and even though it's a rural area, in 1940, the census list the population of Biscoe was 800. Now we've grown since then, but in those days we had one stoplight and a crossroads, and the economy was based on the mill, the cotton mill. But my dad, he was superintendent of the substation when all the switching had to be done by hand, had to be done manually. Now it's all automated and computerized and so forth. They don't have to build a substation or have an operator even. They don't have to build the big building. The substation was a square thing, but it had a tall tower, like a Frankenstein tower in the middle, and it was the tallest building in Biscoe.
Wow, that's interesting. What types of things were you interested in growing up?
I had a bit of an imagination, and let me tell you about my parents first. I was blessed. I was blessed with what I think were about the best parents who ever lived. My father was 6 feet 6 inches tall, handsome. He didn't have my coloring. He had black hair and brown eyes. And my mother was a little 5 foot tall blonde with blue eyes. So I got her coloring, and my kid brother got her coloring, and my sister got dark hair, dark brown hair, and brown eyes. But their parenting, we were we were blessed that they absolutely loved us without qualification. They were moral, beautiful people. They loved us. We felt safe and secure at all times. My father protected us. I just couldn't have had a better set of parents. When I was a kid, I was interested in listening to the Lone Ranger and thinking I might be a cowboy or something, and listen to the radio, and I was interested in photography when I had a little box camera that I got for Christmas. And when I got a little older, I was interested in athletics in school, but I was not a good athlete. I have to add that quickly. I was just mediocre, or not even that good, I guess. We had a small school, but that school attracted wonderful teachers. The English teacher in high school, Emma Connor is her name. I don't know what it is about English teachers, but she got me interested in words and the meaning of words. And she would read to us Shakespeare. You know, kids love to be read to. And Emma would read Shakespeare to us, and even one time took us to Greensboro, where Greensboro College, it was Woman's College, which is now University of North Carolina in Greensboro. It was Woman's College back then, and they were putting on a play of Shakespeare, Macbeth. And Emma Connor got some community people in Biscoe. Would you drive my class, my English class, up to Greensboro to see Macbeth? And by that time, we had memorized some of the lines in Macbeth. So it was really a thrill for us to see that presentation there, and because we could quote some of the lines as they came out on stage, and we would say them under our breath. Anyway, she was marvelous, and except for my parents, she probably had the most impact on me as a student.
So you graduated from Biscoe schools, and then what happened?
I graduated in 1949 and intended to go to the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. But I had a buddy, Vernon Tyson, now a famous minister. He and his brothers, his dad was my minister in Biscoe during my teen years. So he was a year older, and so he went to Guilford College. And when he came home from Guilford one time, he had a talk with me, and he said, I understand you're going to UNC, and he said, that's fine. He said, but Guilford College is different. He said, why don't you let me take you up there and show you around, which he did. Well, I fell in love with Guilford College, and that's where I went for 4 years.
What was your degree in?
I started out in English because of the influence of Emma Connor. When I got to my junior year, my roommate was a guy who was 5 years older than I. And he had tremendous influence on me. I was easily led in those days. So his name was Belton Lewis. So Belton said to me, you better get out of this English department. He said, you'll never get past Dr. Philip Furness, who was head of the department. And he said, why don't you just go with me into physical education, and you can be a coach and a teacher. Well, he convinced me that that's what I ought to do. So I flipped over from English to physical education with a teacher certificate, and that's what I hold today. I was going to be a coach and a teacher.
Well, what happened after you got out of college?
I went directly to the Army. I was drafted at the end of the Korean War. I'm considered a Korean veteran who never went to Korea. But I'm glad I went. I'm glad I had that experience. That was not long after Harry Truman had declared that there would be no separation of the races in the armed forces. And as it turned out, one of my best buddies in the Army was an African-American guy from North Carolina, Claude Flythe, who was so smart that he went on to get a doctorate degree and became assistant president at Virginia State University. And we still maintain contact, phone contact. So I had in the Army, I was section chief for a 105 howitzer outfit. Now, that didn't help me much in civilian life, but I was really got really skilled at that. I mean, my crew and I bragged that we could drop a shell, an artillery shell, in a bushel basket 5 miles away from us if we got the right coordinates.
Interesting. Wow.
When I came out of the Army, I was a little more aggressive. They put me in a leadership situation, and I was a little more aggressive. So I never taught school. I never coached.
Did you come back to Bisco?
Came back to Bisco for a very short time. Then went to Washington, D.C., where I had an uncle who could room and board me for a little while until I could get a job. And that's what happened. I got a job with the investigative division of the Civil Service Commission, which sounds fancy, but I was a clerk. I was on the lowest bottom rung. But my job was to look over the reports coming in from the field. The government really invested. In fact, they investigated me. They went to Bisco and found out all they could from my teachers and from not my parents. They didn't talk to my parents because they would have given me an A+. But they would talk to business people who knew me growing up, and they wanted to know if I had written anything subversive in school or did all of that stuff. And anyway, I would get these reports in Washington, and it was my job to send them to the proper place. I could read them too. I mean, I was cleared for secret, not top secret, but I was cleared to read those reports coming in from the field. So I did that, and that became really kind of boring. and I hadn't had an opportunity in the Army to meet a lot of girls. And so I saw an ad in the Washington Post that said Arthur Murray training classes starting now in the evenings for, I think it was 10 weeks. And so I loved to dance. I grew up in the big band era, and I loved to dance. But I didn't know the fancy stuff. I didn't know the Latin dances and all that. So I'm thinking, wow, I'll just keep my job here with the government. I'll go down to Arthur Murray and learn all these fancy dances. I'll meet a bunch of pretty girls, but Arthur Murray was smarter than I was. Halfway through the training class, he came in. He didn't come in, but his representative came in and said, "Now, if you want to finish this training, you have to sign a contract to teach for us for a year after your training class." Well, now by that time I was just absolutely hooked on it. I wanted to finish that. And sure enough, I finished training class. I taught for Arthur Murray for a year.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
That's weird, isn't it?
I think it's great.
I never intended to be a dance teacher but I was foundering. I was I didn't like the government job because it was really boring. And I wasn't going to be a dance teacher. So I just threw in the towel. I got the Washington Post phone book. And Washington, as you know, has owned and operated stations for the big three network, ABC, CBS, and NBC. Each have a huge station and operation in Washington. And now they have about, I think they can have about 6 owned and operated stations. New York, Washington, Chicago, Los Angeles, Miami, something like that. So I took the phone book and looked up ABC and went over for an interview. And the interviewer said, well, what experience have you had in broadcasting? And I said, none. I said, I've dreamed about being a broadcaster, and I had. I was too young for World War II, but my father followed on radio, followed Ed Murrow and Gabriel Heater. I mean, every night I would sit on the steps with him at the house, and especially in warm weather, with the screen open to the living room where the radio would be playing. And I heard Ed Murrow broadcasting war news from London while the bombs were falling all around him. You know, you know this. I mean, he would go up to a rooftop in London and broadcast live. Everything was live then. Radio broadcast live to America. And as I sat there with my daddy as a boy, I thought, I can't believe that Ed Murrow is speaking to me from London. And the idea and the dream of broadcasting settled into my small little mind, but I didn't think I could ever do it. I thought I could never do anything like that. You know, kids in small towns have a sort of a small town psyche that, you know, maybe I can't do that, but the city kids can probably do that. But I had that dream in the back of my mind to sit in front of a microphone someday. Then in high school, our coach and teacher, coaches had to teach back then, he was interested in radio, and so he formed up a little radio club as an extracurricular activity, and we got little kits and built a radio set that we could listen to on earphones, which meant that at night when all the lights were out in my house, I could turn that on and not bother anybody and listen to radio broadcast. So I had this dream that someday maybe I would be able to sit in front of a microphone, and then I thought, no, only city kids can do that. I can't do that.
So what did they tell you at ABC when you told them you didn't have any experience?
Oh, well, first I went to CBS, which was next in the phone book. And same story there. What's your experience? None. Well, we don't have anything for you. So I went to NBC. That was my last shot. And I was interviewed by an old Scotchman who had been there for a long time. His name was George McKinnon. And he said, you know, you don't have any experience, and there's just nothing I can do for you here. He said, I have a little menial job, but he said, you're older, you're educated, you've been in the military, and you would not like it. He said, I have a job opening for a page, an NBC page. And I said back to him, Mr. McKinnon, if you will let me take that job as a page, I will be the best page you ever had. And sure enough, he said, now, you're going to have to do things that are below your education level and below your age and so forth. He said, most of the pages are college kids. and you're out of college and out of the Army. Anyway, that opened the door for me. That was my chance to get in that building along with David Brinkley and Peter Hackus and all of those great newsmen for NBC. I went in the same door they did, and I had an identification card that looked just like theirs. And I was proud as I could be. And as it happened, things in life happen that you don't expect. And NABIT, the union of the engineers and the assistant directors, went on strike in the summer of 1958. They went on a long strike. It lasted about 8 or 10 weeks. Well, the Pages were in management. So the management of the station would take people like me and throw us into something that we never had done before to keep the network and the local station on the air. So that's what happened to me is I became an assistant director. Boom. That means you stand beside the camera. You know all about this. You're a TV guy, but in those days you stood beside the camera and you listened to the director for time cues for the talent. You made the talent comfortable and so on and so forth, and brought them water if they got thirsty and whatever. I did that for as long as the strike lasted. But here's a key element. I met the woman that I married. I met the girl that I married at NBC. And one of the Page's duties was to take the interoffice mail around to the different offices, deliver it and so forth. And so I actually delivered her interoffice mail to her desk. Now she was secretary to the director of operations, which is a huge deal. If you can, NBC is where Meet the Press originates. It's where Washington, D.C. is the news capital of the world. So all the news network operations there, NBC radio news on the hour, a lot of them originated from Washington. So Nancy was secretary to the director of operations. She was so smart that her boss just let her handle the unions, and her job was to study the union contracts such that they could save as much money as they could without too much overtime, without doing what was called short turnaround, which was doubled up on the salaries for the people. And that was her job. And she was smart, she was delightful. Then in the spring of 1959, they had to post job openings. So they post, because of the unions, they had a posting for a summer replacement staff announcer. That was so that the regular guys, Willard Scott was one of them, could go on vacation. And so I auditioned for summer replacement announcer. And doggone if I didn't win it. I won the audition, and people were flying in. A guy from Raleigh, Durham, whose name escapes me right now, flew up to Washington to take the audition. I thought he was much better than I was. But anyway, I won the audition. That's how I got on the air. The first thing I ever did on the air when I was a summer replacement was to give the system cue after Meet the Press. And all I had to say was, when the mic came on, I was just to say, "This is the NBC television network." That was the first thing I ever said, and I was so nervous that I practiced. I didn't sleep the night before, and I practiced all night long on how to give this system cue, because I knew that my voice would be going nationwide, and I practiced in every possible way that I could, like, this is the NBC television network. No, this is the NBC television network. And I went through all of that. And it came down to Meet the Press ran a little bit over, and I only had 3 seconds to say it as fast as I could and get off the air. Anyway, I'm rambling, I'm sorry.
That's a great story.
So after I was on the air for the summer, I had now gained some experience at a network station. And Mac McGarry, one of the great NBC announcers in Washington, pointed out to me in Broadcast Magazine that there was an opening for a radio announcer in North Carolina at a 50,000 watt station, and I knew there were only two, WBT and WPTF. And, you know, call this number or whatever, and if you want an interview. And so I called, and sure enough, it was WPTF, and came down. Nancy and I, by this time, were engaged. I brought Nancy down here. I didn't take her to the interview. But Graham Pointer, the old program director at WPTF at the time, hired me on the spot. And that's how I got to Raleigh. I married Nancy, and she's from Baltimore. I married her in Baltimore, brought her away from all of her friends, and she loved her boss. He loved her, took her away from all of that and brought her down here to a little walk-up apartment on St. Mary Street, 3rd floor walk-up, and plunked her down. Now, bless her heart, she's been marvelous for me. She understood, and you understand, that broadcasters don't have a 9-to-5 job. You either work early in the morning or you work from the middle of the afternoon till midnight, one or the other. And but she understood that. She's been my cheerleader and my supporter, and I guess my biggest fan. And she's just been marvelous. She's a perfect broadcaster's wife. She understands when you have to go, you have to go. Doesn't make any difference where it is or when it is, and so forth. Anyway, she's been marvelous and still is. We've been married 57 years.
Oh, congratulations, guys. That's great. Well, tell us about your experience at WPTF.
I think I stayed at WPTF too long because I was more interested in news and instead of, you know, I was a disc jockey. You know, you play records and you give the time and the temperature and you read the commercials. But near the end of my 10 years at WPTF, I got to do a live telephone call-in show, which was called Ask Your Neighbor. And so that suited me fine because it was more of a challenge. You know, you have people calling in and you have to deal with it and so on. One of the stories that sticks with me forever is that Graham Pointer, the old program director, when we started that live show, call-in show, he and I discussed it, and we decided that the people in eastern North Carolina, the main coverage area for WPTF, were so nice that we did not need to put a delay on the radio show, that there wouldn't be any trouble with profanity and obscenities and things like that. And sure enough, I went from call to call for the first year and a half maybe. And nothing, you know, everything was above board. No one cursed or anything. So I got a call one day, you know, I just went from one call to another, and it was not up to me to give answers to these caller questions. It was just to connect them with somebody else who knew the answer. So this little old lady calls me one day and says, "Mr. Gaddy, I've got a problem." She says, "In the springtime, the woodpeckers come and just peck all up under the eaves of my house." And she said, "They're just ruining it." And she said, "I just don't know what to do about it." And I said, "Well, I don't know, but maybe somebody who knows something about this will call and give us an answer." And I went on to another call or two, punched up another call, and there was a young male voice. "Mr. Gaddy, I'd like to help with that. I'd like to help that lady who has problems with the woodpeckers." He said, "I'm a student over here at NC State." Now, I'm so naive, I'm thinking, great. This kid is probably studying these kinds of problems on the, you know, in agriculture or something. And I said, "Okay, what's your answer?" He said, "Down here in Harnett County, we take out our 12-gauge shotguns and blow the blankety blank blanks to kingdom come." Well, there weren't blankety blank blanks. You can imagine what he said. So the very next day, we had a 15-second delay on the broadcast.
You had mentioned that you were a disc jockey. What kind of format did WPTF have then? What kind of records?
It was based mainly on the taste of Graham Pointer. He dominated. I mean, he would take a brand new record album and he would personally scratch out. He would listen to it, personally scratch out the songs he didn't like. But it was mainly big band, jazz, on Sundays, gospel music. Classical music. We had the FM station in those days was all classical music. I did a recorded classical music show that was played back at night. And that's before FM became the giant, you know. Yeah. You remember those days.
People didn't know what to do with FM stations.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
So they had classical music or whatever was convenient.
Right. But the good thing about that is I learned how to pronounce all those fancy musicians and composers, you know?
That was a good thing.
I mean, I can still, you know, I can still pronounce them, so anyway.
So how did you leave WPTF? What were the circumstances?
Channel 5 had come after me once before, after about 3 years on WPTF, when a man named Ted Powers was their television anchor, and for whatever reasons, Ted left. And so they came after me and wanted to interview me at that time, and I thought that, you know, going from radio to television might mean a pretty substantial increase in salary. Well, they offered me, at that time now, it was under different management, it was under A.J. Fletcher, but let's see, who interviewed me? I can't remember who interviewed me. It was not A.J., but anyway, they offered me, when I got to the salary, they offered me a $5 a week raise. And I thought, you know, that if they're that tightwadded, maybe I ought to just stay here where I am. Mm-hmm. So anyway, the second time they came after me, there was a nice raise, and boy, did I ever luck into a good situation over there at Channel 5. Now, I got there before Jim Goodman had taken over. The station was run by Jesse Helms and A.J. Fletcher and the sales department.
They ran it too?
Yes.
Well, and of course, for people that are watching this that may not be as familiar with the North Carolina markets or the Raleigh market, you know, we're talking about WRAL TV and the owners which is Channel 5 and a legendary station. And it's interesting. Tell us a little more about. You said it's run by the sales department. What does that mean?
Well, it meant that. See, I was used to a news department. At WPTF, we had an excellent news department. And I had come from NBC to WPTF. The news department was off limits for sales and straight up. But over at Channel 5, when I went there, the sales department could dictate news coverage. For instance, if a shopping center were opening up in Wilson, the sales department would call the news director and say, there's a big shopping center opening up and a lot of our clients are going to be buying commercials down there and we want you to go down there and cover it. Interesting. That was what was happening then. Now, they didn't dictate every story, but the thing is, they could do things like that and get away with it. And I was not used to that at all.
What was Jesse Helms' title at that time?
He was Executive Vice President. He was not the president, but the Executive Vice President had all the power. It was A.J. and Jesse.
And this was in 1970 when you went there?
Yeah. Now, Jesse was there 1 year after I got there. You know, he announced for the Senate. Then when he announced for the Senate, he had to come off the air because of at that time, the equal time amendment for the FCC.
Yeah, they'd had
equal
to give free time
rule. Yeah. So every time he went on the air, the station would have to give the same amount of time, and it was a lot of time. You know, Jesse was on 5 nights a week, and he could go for as long as he wanted to. I mean, it would last anywhere from 3 to 6 minutes if he wanted to. So anyway, Jesse had to get off the air and attend to his politics.
So what was your first job at WRAL?
I did a television version of Ask Your Neighbor.
Really?
Yeah. It was called Good Morning, Charlie.
And you took call-ins?
It took callers, yeah.
And again, you matched people up or you invited other people to call in
and
help solve a problem.
And it was a fun thing to do. I would get people like any celebrity who came to town who had something to promote would want to be on that show. I had Roy Rodgers, I had Jimmy Dean, I had Ferrante Teicher, I had the great Charlie Byrd from Washington, D.C., the great guitarist.
Did they perform on your show as well?
Some of them would, yeah.
Because that's, that's still, there were live performances on television then more so than now. So, and what time did your show run from?
Well, they changed it. They changed it around a bit. I think the first run was from 7 to 8, and then it went from 8 to 9 or something like that.
So you were after the morning news.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I would have what I thought were interesting people in the news as my normal guests. I mean, I couldn't have a celebrity every day.
Right.
And but I remember I would have African American people. I would have. I remember this first female student body president of NC State University, and she was very controversial at the time. Oh, I can't think of her name. But I thought she was interesting. I thought she was really bright, and I would have her on. And that was when the college kids were rebelling against everything. And her name was Kathy Sterling. Kathy Sterling.
So you had interesting people on, celebrities, different things to start discussions. And did you take call-ins? Yes? People called in?
Yes.
Yes. That's what I thought. That's
then
what I thought.
I don't know why management, I don't know why AJ and Jesse decided that that ought to be a news format instead of a call-in. So on one Friday afternoon, I was informed that starting the Monday that I would be doing a news show instead of Good Morning Charlie. And and at that time it was fine with me. I wanted to do something serious. And so I started doing a news show in that time slot. And then that went from my doing that show to starting on the anchor and the 6 o'clock news, and then the 11 o'clock news was added to that. So I was doing 6 and 11 for years, and the thing that when I hooked up with Jim Goodman, all good things began to happen to me as a newsman and a news anchor and a broadcaster. He is a child of the space age. He's a good man. He started releasing money to buy the best equipment, to hire the best management people. The station always made money. I mean, Mr. AJ, he had the golden touch, but the station was not progressing as a place for excellent journalism as it should have until Jim took over. And then we took off like a rocket.
And that wasn't very long after you started there.
No. We took off like a sleep. It was like a sleeping giant being awakened, and I'm so proud to have been a part of. Jim's idea was, in fact, stated idea, that we're going to become the best news operation of any local station in America, and I believe there would be a lot of argument that we didn't become that, but I can argue that we did.
I think you did too.
I mean, we won every award you can win. We we were recognized nationally as one of the best news operations in the country, and we have all kinds of Emmys and awards too. And it was Jim Goodman who let us take off like that.
Now, when you started on the 6 and 11 o'clock news, tell us who the anchor team was. You were the anchor. And who was doing weather and sports?
Bob Caudle was doing weather. Do you remember Bob?
I don't.
And Nick Pond was doing sports. And I was anchoring the news, and didn't have a co-anchor. That was back before co-anchors came in. Thank goodness they did.
Single anchor.
Because they changed broadcasting.
Really did.
You know, there was a time when a woman could only do a woman's show. You know, recipes and not that needs to be shoved aside, but that's all they could do. I mean, I can remember when Pauline Frederick was the only person on network radio, the only woman on network radio, and there was no national person on. I guess Barbara Walters was the first female co-anchor.
Yeah.
And then Jim decided we needed a co-anchor, and the first one that I sat beside on that desk was Bobby Batista. Remember Bobby?
I have seen footage, but I was not here when that happened.
Well, she was amazingly good, and she went on to become one of the big co-anchors at CNN. Yeah.
There have been a lot of people at WRAL that have gone on to bigger and better things, and you stayed there. And as we talked about earlier, I was aware, and you too, that you had one of the highest likability scores as they did research of anchors of any station in the country. And you had a weatherman that had that honor as well. We had a couple of golden likability people. Talk a little bit about that.
My chance to go network came about like this. I didn't have an agent. Even the reporters these days have agents. These days, I didn't have an agent. I never sent a tape out to anybody or anything. But when Ted Turner was putting together CNN, and I think this was 19, I don't remember, 1979, I think. Anyway, I got this call from Ted Turner's office saying that they would like to discuss a project with me, and would I fly down to Atlanta at their expense and talk about it. I went down there, and this old program director and news director of CBS started talking with me about CNN and how, he says, Charlie, we're going to sign on and never sign off. And it's going to be solid news, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, forever. And I thought that was the boldest idea I had ever heard. And they took me out to what they call the satellite farm. And there were these dishes out there, and he would point out that that dish is to Africa, that one is to Europe, that one's to so-and-so, and that was to Asia. And I got so excited I couldn't stand it, and I just couldn't wait to get back. And he said, well, are you under contract at Capitol Broadcasting? I said, yes. He said, well, that's going to be a problem. I said, no, it won't. I said, I've served Capitol Broadcasting Company very well for 9 years. And I said, Jim Goodman, when he finds out how excited I am about it, he will let me out of my contract. I had 2 years left on my contract with WRAL. So I came back and presented it to Jim Goodman, and he said, no. He said, I can't let you go. And I said, well, don't let that be your final answer. And I waited a little while, and I asked him to have lunch with me again. And he had lunch with me, and we discussed it, and he just said, Charlie, you can't. He said, I'm not going to let you out. Now, I was really hurt by that initially. Now, CNN had a good slot for me, a primetime slot for me, but they have to go on. I mean, they can't get embroiled in a legal thing trying to get their anchors in place. So I would have left for CNN to help sign that thing on, because to me it was out of this world. I mean, I'd never heard of anything like that.
It was exciting.
It was
Very
exciting
yeah.
for me, yes. Anyway, Jim Goodman did lots of good things for me, and so I have no regrets. But that's what happened. That was my chance at the network.
So how soon did your co-anchors change? You have some other people that have come on that have been legendary on the WRAL news desk with you.
The next was let's see. The next was Adele Arakawa. Mm-hmm. I don't know whether you remember seeing her or seeing a tape of her.
I do not. I have seen a tape of her.
She was excellent. She was excellent, and she moved from. After a time, she moved from Raleigh to Chicago. That big station up there that you know the call letters probably better than
Probably
I.
WLS.
Yeah, I think it was. And then she moved from there, and then I lost track of her. She moved from there to Denver. Mm-hmm. Then there was a period for 2 years, I think it was 2 years, that I did not have a co-anchor. Thank goodness the ratings held up, but I really wanted a co-anchor because by this time women had begun to really flourish, and they were really smart, and they were being discovered as news people, and as smart, and sometimes much smarter than the men that they worked with. So let's see, the next anchor was Donna Gregory. Did you ever?
I do remember Donna.
She was a delight. She was bright and fun and really a smart news person. She was excellent on the air. People remember her, and then there was, after Donna, there was
It's hard to keep track. You had some great weather people and sports anchors as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Who was it, honey?
Ann Devlin.
No, it wasn't Ann Devlin, sweetie. Give us a minute here. She'll
right.
think of it. Bob DeBartlehaven
Yes.
was this unbelievable weatherman. Now, he was not a meteorologist. He had to parrot what the National Weather Service told him to talk about. But he had the personality. He had first of all, he had what I call the golden broadcast voice. If that voice, I mean, it was a gift. I mean, he was born with that. And he was so likable and so friendly and on the air, and everybody loved him, and he was highly successful. And he was a spark plug for our newscast. And Tom Suter, you know,
Great guy.
the great Tom Suter. When Nick Pond left and Tom Suter became the sports anchor, and thank goodness for him. I mean, he was there. In fact, he hasn't been retired but about 2 years.
Yeah, yeah.
He came about a year or two after I did. And I just had dinner with him, by the way, and we talked over old times and fun times that we had. But so we had a lot of good people.
You did. You know, one of the things that we talked about a little bit earlier is you were greatly involved in many, many local events and charities. You've helped so many people, and WRAL is a wonderful community citizen, and you've been a big part of that for years and years and years. And if there's something going on, boy, and that's Jim Goodman. Jim really believes in community. His wife believes in community. And, that we've all benefited from that. And sometimes we don't take pause to realize just how lucky the community has been to have a leader in that position that can provide the support and the reporting and all the things that TV stations do for communities. And that's really been such a huge benefit. But one of the things we talked about earlier that I think was really interesting, I'd asked you about the Charlie Gaddy Child Development Center. And that goes back for a long ways. And could you talk a little bit about your relationship with the telethons and how that all came about? I think that's special.
I'm glad you realize how important Jim Goodman is to this community and the larger community, to this state. I mean, he is, and I was so lucky to be able to team up with him because he has this outreach, as you mentioned. He has this community outreach. Every good thing that helps the community, he is involved in it. Now, my interest in this goes back to my parents. In that little tiny town that I've talked about before, my mother and father were involved in the community. They were, my dad was in the Lions Club, my mother was in the Women's Club. Anything that they could participate in that made the community better. And so I inherited that kind of yen to try to help people who are less fortunate and so forth. Then when I teamed up with Goodman, and he had the power of a television station, a powerful television station, I got involved in everything that he was involved in and loved it. I absolutely loved it. We raised millions on the telethons, the coats for kids, the lighting of the tower, the Christmas tower. The Jim Goodman at one year kind of helped bail out Shaw University when it had financial trouble. With his Fletcher Foundation, there's the Fletcher Theater downtown. I mean, I could go on. He bought a Stradivarius violin so that promising violin students could have the very best instrument in the world. He bought it and loans it out to promising violin students, and all they have to do is pay for the insurance while they're using it.
Did not know that.
And the Fletcher Foundation has underwritten countless things. I mean, the healing place for alcoholics here in Raleigh, both for men and for women. Barbara Goodman was a prime mover in that. Jim Goodman was a prime mover in getting this Dick's property for the Dick's Park. He was one of the prime movers in that. I mean, it just goes on and on.
But you were a big part of a lot of things too. And to honor you for all of your service with the telethons and raising funds for Easter Seals and their other and their sister organizations, they named the Child Development Center after you. It's the Charlie Gaddy Child Development Center.
And I'm so proud of that because I know what happens there. We take children from a few months old until they're 5. And some of those children have autism, some of them have the condition of cerebral palsy and other disabilities. And the staff there gives those children the best possible start that they can get anywhere in that center. And they love those children, and it's tough love. They teach and love them and have them develop. That's why it's called a development center. For instance, some of those children come there and they don't have the dexterity to tie their shoes, or they are distracted by autism. And to see that staff work with those children just makes me so proud that I had a little bit of a part in that.
I think that's terrific. Now, looking back over your 24 years at Capitol Broadcasting, I know people have probably asked this question, but what do you think's the best thing that ever happened to you there?
The best thing that ever happened to me there?
Mm-hmm.
Well, the best thing that ever happened to me there was when Jim Goodman took over. Yeah, I can say that unequivocally. We had the best equipment. We had good management. He began to change us into the dynamo that we needed to be.
And he's not afraid to try new things. And I've heard Jim say, he has serial number 1 of almost every piece of new equipment that comes out.
That's right.
And
he will roll the dice.
That's right.
I mean, if it's new, Goodman is going to get it. And if it doesn't work out, okay, he'll take responsibility.
So what advice do you have for people today that think they want a career in broadcasting? The business has changed an awfully lot. And if someone came to you and said, gosh, Mr. Gaddy, I think I want to be a television newscaster, would you tell them to run?
No, I've had a wonderful Listen, I wouldn't discourage any young person. I mean, even when I got into it, it was competitive. It's even more competitive now, but there are many more outlets. Many more outlets. And so I don't discourage kids who, no one could have stopped me from getting my foot in the door. One thing is learn English and grammar and, get well grounded in that. Study some history, study a lot of English, study some biographies about great people, and get a good general knowledge of things. And we can teach the skills. We can teach you to sit up straight and comb your hair and go from one camera to the other. Let me tell you what David Brinkley told me when I was a kid in Washington. And I said to him one time, I said, Mr. Brinkley, I want to get into the news business and as a broadcaster, and do you have any advice for me? And you know how David kind of grunted when he said, well, yes, I can tell you a thing or two. He said, here's the most important thing. And boy, I'm listening, I'm thinking I'm going to get something really profound. And David looked at me and he said, just remember, have your butt, even though he used the A word, have your butt in your seat at least 5 seconds before the red light comes on. And that was David's advice for me.
What other interesting advice have you had in your career?
Nothing.
And that was from another North Carolinian.
That's right.
Yes.
I've always been proud that Ed Murrow, David Brinkley, Charles Kuralt, and Charlie Rose are all from North Carolina.
That's right.
And boy, did those 4 make an impact. Wow.
Yeah.
I've always been proud of that. A lot of people don't realize that all 4 of them were North Carolina guys.
And there's a lot more too. It's really impressive.
Yes.
Any special moment that sticks out in your mind in your years at Capitol Broadcasting that more than anything else?
The ice storm that brought our tower down.
Yeah.
I can't remember the year now. You probably remember.
I wonder if it was '84. I don't know either.
I thought it would be months before we could recover. Mm-hmm. Now I think it took a year to put that tower back up.
Yeah, I bet it did.
But what happened, for people that don't know about it, the ice storm came and when it started melting, these cables for the tower that big around.
Yeah, the guy wires.
The guy wires, and of course, for a tower that tall, you know more about. You had the tallest tower in the country at one time, didn't you?
Well, it was pretty tall.
Anyway, when the ice storm started melting, it melted on one side, mm-hmm. and all that weight dropped off of one side of those cables, and those cables started whipping back and forth. Mm-hmm. And it was the cables whipping back and forth that brought that whole tower down.
Yeah.
And I thought we were out of business, but somehow Jim Goodman got some station in Fayetteville or someplace to hook up some kind of little transmitter deal, and we stayed on the air, although we lost a lot of
coverage
area.
Yeah.
But we stayed on the air. And that was one of the memorable moments.
That was a traumatic time.
Yeah.
And luckily it was not a, you hear about tower accidents. I'm so thankful there was no one on the tower, but the ice, there's so much weight.
And when television goes, when the tower goes down, that is monumental in a disaster kind of thing. But Jim kept us on the air somehow.
Well, Charlie, you're a remarkable guy. You've got a lot of stories, and we could talk for several days, and I wish we would. But what's next for you? I still see you in the community and doing things and honoring friends and different people. What are you up to these days, and
First of all, I'm still in good health.
Yes.
And I'm blessed to be in good health because my wife is not in good health. But I'm blessed to be able to take care of her. She's number one. That's my number one goal, my precious cheerleader and best friend and everything. And I keep up my public service work. I still am a volunteer for Easter Seals UCP. I do a little stuff around here. You know, we've lived here 37 years in this same house, and we live on about 2.5 acres, so I can work outside, and I love to write, mostly things that are not published, but I love to write, and I've written a biography of Dr. Leroy Walker soon after I retired. I did that, and so I'm not idle at all, and I don't know. I don't. You know, when you're young, you have that much past and that much future. When you get old, you have that much future and that much past. And so I'm lucky to be vertical and be able to do things.
Well, thank you for spending some time with us today, and I appreciate your comments and sharing with everyone, and thanks for everything you've done.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Tell us about your time with Mr. Khrushchev.
Nancy, being secretary to the director of operations, was in charge of assigning crew people to different telecasts. Nancy would assign me to some prize telecast because she did the assignments for her boss.
Right, while you were at NBC in Washington.
And so when the Emmy Awards came up, national telecast, network telecast, for the Washington portion of the Emmy Awards, which was the news portion, Nancy assigned me to be assistant director for that. And my mother, sitting in Bisco, when the camera swung around to pick up the recipients for the award, it happened to pass by me, and my mother almost fainted in Bisco seeing her son on the air. Now, in the summer of '59, Premier Nikita Khrushchev made his famous historic visit to Washington. And he was to do a major broadcast from our station, NBC, in Washington, and there were only about 5 people that were allowed in the studio when he was in the studio, and Nancy assigned me to be the assistant director for that telecast. So here I am, a boy from Bisco, I'm meeting the Russian premier, Nikita Khrushchev, through his interpreter, and I took care of him on that program. So, I mean, it's amazing some of the things I've been able to do, and Jim Goodman has let me go on assignment to Saudi Arabia and to England and to France and to Honduras and to China. You know, join Capital Broadcasting and see the world. But it's been a wonderful, wonderful life for me. in the studio with Khrushchev, and the KGB people were all over the station. They were behind curtains and everywhere. And so was the American, the Americans were responsible for him. The Secret Service had to also take care of Khrushchev. So they were everywhere. And in those days, the assistant directors on television had this grease pencil that if we had to write something for the talent that's on the air, and hold it up beside the camera, we could do it very quickly with that big felt grease pencil. And it actually had a wick in it and had ink in it. And it was a tube. It was about the size of a big cigar. And so I'm standing getting ready for the telecast of Nikita Khrushchev, and I reached in my pocket just out of habit and pulled out that grease pencil, which was aluminum. All of a sudden, these big Russians rushed me, and they didn't knock me down, but they started pushing me back, and it scared the bejeebers out of me. I didn't know why.
Yeah.
And they grabbed that out of my hand, and they thought that tube, that aluminum tube, was some kind of weapon. When they looked at it and saw it wasn't, they brushed me off and straightened me up, and it scared me to death.
I bet that's right. Wow. Wow.